Today we're going to be looking at a scenario where the Mongol Empire comes into the What If Civilization Started overworld. This is episode 85, I think. I got this map from the WICSO Discord. So thanks to those peeps. We can see the ongoing Libyan civil war. Probably not going to touch on this issue. Maybe I will. I don't know. But anyway, this country has just come into the world and now it's going to be using... it's not going to be the Mongol Empire from... the real world where it's like using horses and stuff. It's gonna have all the power from all the countries it absorbed. So if we look at an old map, now I don't really know how to overlay it. I guess maybe I can... I'm trying to think how to overlay this. And now if we go ahead and overlay the Mongol borders on to the old world, you can kind of see here. Now I don't know what good opacity is, but you can kind of see here. You can see that it has most of China. Let me actually turn on cities and capitals. It doesn't have the capital city of China, but it has this region here. Most of this pink country, this yellow country, Korea's capital, most of the seafoam green Siberian country, Tibet in there. Tibet's probably decently powerful, or at least in terms of economic strength, because they were one of the Security Council members. This Pakistani region, all of Persia, most of the Mesopotamian country, Anatolia, Caucasus region, Russia, Central Asia, Ukraine or Crimea, and a lot of Eastern Europe. So, pretty strong. Main regions are the Mesopotamian region. They have a pretty good chunk of it, as well as Persia and parts of India. So that part's developed. Tibet's also decently developed. And then China over here. So you kind of have these, two main groups over here. And I guess Russia is decently strong, but they aren't actually too strong. And they're not actually that populated, looking at this map. There's the same amount of cities in Russia as there are in this golden Ukrainian country, which is interesting. But yeah, Mongol Empire, very strong country. I say they're the strongest country. But let me go ahead and put up the right map, which will be this one, as we'll be colouring in the Mongol country as this colour. And we can go ahead and look at some wars. And the first thing we see is the Mongol Empire finishing off a few countries. Sorry, Tibet. Sorry, whatever country this is. What country even is that? Okay, this... Didn't even know there was a country here, I'm not going to lie, so they're gone. This pink country up here, they'll put up some fight, however, eventually they'll fall. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire will finally learn how to use boats and end up taking over the island of Sakhalin, because they have the technology of all the countries they captured. They will also go ahead and launch some invasions into Russia, if I can pick the right color, as well as pink Kazakhstan, and finally, or at least somewhat finally, that blue country. And any other countries they finish off? Probably not, actually. While we're on it, they'll go ahead and launch an invasion of the rest of Russia. However, before they can do that, we see that Poland takes this opportunity and takes over most of Estonia. And I guess not really to do with the Mongol Empire, actually, but we see this region of Crete end up just going over to Greece, as it's like an exclave, and these people would rather be a part of Greece than be invaded by the Mongol Empire, but the rest of Crete remains independent. And also Crete will be moving their capital over here. I'm not going to go ahead and remove any capitals, because I think it's kind of interesting to see. But what I will be doing is recoloring these cities here. What I don't get is, what is the point, of recoloring in the cities when you can just recolor the country? I don't know. But anyway, peace treaty, pretty simple. Most of this land that they have invaded will go ahead and be annexed, if I can go ahead and find it. Down here, annexed. Up over here, a pretty big portion of land is annexed. I think that is it. Although in Eastern Europe, we can go ahead and look at a peace treaty, maybe involving provinces. I guess we can. Although, to be fair, the Mongol Empire does not follow provinces at all. But I guess their new borders kind of can. As we see that most of the Russian land actually just goes over to Poland. They go ahead and take it. Although some of it does go over to the Mongol Empire. Now Poland's not really Poland-Lithuania. They're more like Poland-Estonia, I guess. Poland-Latvia or whatever. But their borders are looking weird. But it is because they lost a pretty big chunk of land from the Mongols. But anyway, what are these Mongols going to be doing as their first plan of action? Well, they're going to be getting revenge on an old enemy, and that is China. China is very weak. I mean, they lost like almost all their land, still have a lot of people, but they did just lose a world war, and the Mongols are going to go ahead and finish off China. Now, if you haven't noticed, and I should have said this at the start, the Mongol map that I drew depends on what time period. It's probably not even accurate from any time period. I looked up a map. There were like 17 different maps. I chose one that I thought would be interesting and did this. So I know at one point the Mongols technically had all of China and that was their peak, but I chose this one instead. But we see the Mongols quickly go ahead and surround the Chinese capital, like so, before wiping out the southern area, and eventually the capital of China will fall. And in this peace treaty, the Mongol Empire fully annexes them. And just to make sure that there's no possible chance of another China rising up, they will launch their troops into South China about a week later, and this will go very well. Although we do see over here that the China, or at least South China, does manage to make some pretty big counteroffensive, managing to take back 2 major cities. However, down in the south, someone wants their revenge, and that is Vietnam. As we see Vietnam pour into this country, sending out many troops into here. They just lost the World War, and they want their land back. Now, would Vietnam be that strong? I don't know, but I guess South China is kind of collapsing. And people have heard the terrors of the Mongols and would rather be under Vietnam. Actually, that's probably not true, but whatever. But nonetheless, we go ahead and see that most of this country does go ahead and eventually fall over to Vietnam or the Mongols. While we see that South China flees over to Taiwan, as we see combined Indonesian, Korean, Japanese, and North Japanese navies protect Taiwan. And we actually see the creation of a brand new military alliance, which will be this Pentagon alliance. Now, I did just steal this from Europe, but I mean, it's only Poland in that alliance now, so whatever. But the Pentagon alliance will be a new alliance formed between South China, which has now become Taiwan, Japan, the Japanese countries, Korea, and Indonesia. So yeah, we see China yet again flee to Taiwan, putting their capital in the north of the country. And the new borders look something like this. Yes, I'm aware, border gore, whatever. But we see Vietnam take a few provinces, like these ones here, while also taking this land. However, the Mongols do take this province, which awkwardly leaves this little like exclave, or like gap here, if you will, in which the Mongols do have access to the sea. And we actually see that the Mongols will be making an alliance of their own. The Mongol Empire's alliance will go ahead and contain themselves, but also Vietnam. They just formed a war. Vietnam doesn't like any of its neighbors. The Mongols don't like any of their neighbors, so they're going to go ahead and join this. But we also see that the Siberian country, as well as the Seafoam Green country, which has one major city in it, so don't really know how they exist, go ahead and join this Pentagon Pact. Also, Poland technically isn't in this, at least not right now. We also see the creation of the Parallelogram Alliance. Now, this alliance is led by Norway, which will contain Germany as well as the Dutch, the French, and it's basically like a Western European bloc, if you will. As we see various different European countries end up joining this alliance. And we see Poland does go ahead and join this alliance. However, there are a few key countries which don't go ahead and join this. And unfortunately for Finland, who persists on being neutral, they are going to go ahead and get absolutely blasted. They're going to see bad things happen as the Mongols come in and they absolutely just destroy Finland in a matter of weeks and the country surrenders. And in this peace treaty, the Mongols will go ahead and fully annex them. And unfortunately, I've run out of shapes on the map, so I'm going to have to go ahead and make my own shapes for the alliance which is about to appear, which will be the Square Alliance, created by the Mesopotamian country. Now, this is way too big of a square. There we go. And it will go ahead and contain the blue country, as well as the pink country, the purple country, the brown country, and maybe these 2 countries down here. Sure, why not? And this is another anti-Mongol alliance. And now, looking at their options, the Mongols want more land. They don't really want to fight a coalition, so anyone in an alliance is out. Bangladesh and India, maybe, but they are kind of protected by the Himalayas. Maybe they can invade Bangladesh, but they don't really want to upset India, as India is probably the 2nd strongest country in the world, if I'm being honest. But anyway, let's go ahead and look at a war, and who are they going to be invading? Well, they're going into Europe. As the Mongols charge on into the Farmers' Union, And you might be like, why didn't the Farmers Union join this alliance? Well, they don't like any of Western Europe because they collapsed Rome. So, yeah, they're going to be launching an invasion of this land and taking it over. And subsequently fully annexing it. And similarly, this orange country over here, yeah, not doing too hot. You're dead as well. And in response to this, we see a lot more countries are going to go ahead and flock over to this alliance, including Greece, as well as Ireland over here. And we also see West Africa enter in this alliance, which basically just leads to almost all of Europe joining this anti-Mongol alliance, like so, until eventually every single country surrounding the Mongols is in alliance, except one, and that is Crete. They're going to get blasted, and they're going to get annexed. Should have joined an alliance, Crete, idiot. And finally, we see that Bangladesh will be seeing an invasion from the Mongols. However, there's lots of mountains here. But where there aren't lots of mountains, or at least there are less mountains, Vietnam will go ahead and blast right into Bangladesh and destroy them. In this peace treaty, we actually see everything go over to Vietnam, and that is because the province layer won't allow me to draw borders. So I guess Vietnam fully annexes this land. And Vietnam is probably a rising world power now. I mean, they have their Strait of Malacca back, so that's something. And at this point, every single country that the Mongols border is in an alliance. And we see that Ireland is going to go ahead and call a General Assembly without the Mongol country. And they're going to go ahead and devise up a plan. It's called the Coalition of the Ready, with the name signaling that any country in the coalition is ready to take down this evil and stop them. And we see that the Parallelogram Alliance, the Square Alliance, and the Pentagon Alliance will all simultaneously declare war on the Mongol Empire in the name of freedom and liberation. And we see over in Western Europe that Polish and Allied troops push in. Now, I am using a purple for basically the whole Western European front, because otherwise it's going to look confusing. But the liberators push in, and they take major city after major city, taking St. Petersburg. And we quickly see the rebels rise up with Norwegian help, and all of Finland quickly returns over to the coalition of the ready. We also see Greece launch an invasion into these newly annexed lands, which will quickly rise up in support, and this land over here is encircled. And we quickly see that the Mongols were not, in fact, ready for this invasion, and are getting blasted in Europe. However, where they did have troops stationed was in Anatolia, as they have launched an invasion and completely kicked Greece out of the Anatolian Peninsula. Meanwhile, the Mesopotamian country has pushed in and managed to retake a lot of their land. However, the Mongols are not giving up this land easily, as it is some of their most developed land, and they will fight for this. And they will actually outmaneuver the Mesopotamian country, and they actually managed to just capitulate it, which is a huge loss for the coalition, as they lose one of their strongest countries. And this is mainly because the Mesopotamian country was heavily weakened by this, and the Mongol country actually had plans of invading Mesopotamia, so they had huge forces stationed there, which Mesopotamia didn't know about. And quickly, their front collapses as they are left over here in like Lebanon and modern day, like, I guess, kind of Syria-ish, Palestine maybe, I don't know. But they also exist on Cyprus, however, not for long, as Cyprus is taken over. Now, I kind of thought Cyprus was their own country, but I guess not. We see up here the Mongols quickly go ahead and take over the major cities along the border of this, like, Siberian country. Meanwhile, they take the only major city of the seafoam green country, which causes it to surrender. However, North Japan does launch an invasion into this peninsula over here, which goes very well as they secure it. And they also launch an invasion up into Sakhalin, which they do go ahead and manage to take over the island. Meanwhile, Korean troops do roll up into the Mongols, however they are quickly beaten back as the Mongols go ahead and arrive. As the Mongols have a huge ton of manpower from China, and this quickly leads to Korea getting absolutely blasted. Meanwhile, over in India, Indian forces quickly move into Persia, doing very well. However, when they try and move into Bangladesh, they are held off fiercely by Vietnam. Meanwhile, Vietnam goes on the offensive, decisively defeating the Indonesian navy and landing over in northern Sumatra and taking over their island. And we actually see that the Mongols will go ahead and find themselves an ally, and that is actually going to be Australia over here. As Australia quickly sends their troops over into Indonesia, as Indonesia is being killed on both sides and they quickly lose the eastern portion of their country. Meanwhile, Vietnamese troops land over in Borneo and quickly taking over the northern part, leaving Indonesia only in Java, southern Borneo and southern Sumatra. Big naval battles take place along here, however no side is really winning. Elsewhere, the Mongols have basically fully capitulated the Siberian country, so we'll go ahead and colour them in as blue. And in terms of landmass, the Mongols are dominating, but they're really not. But we see that the Arabian armies have gone ahead and consolidated themselves and have attempted to re-liberate into Mesopotamia. However, they cannot go ahead and get anywhere near the capital, as the capital region is fiercely held, although they do manage to take a few major cities nearby. Over here, the Greek navy manages to take back Crete and Rhodes. Well, over in Libya, the Mongols heavily fund this country up here, this group up here, and they do manage to basically completely win the Libyan civil war, which has been happening for a long time, like so. And we see that this new pro-Mongol Libyan government goes ahead and joins the Circle Alliance. In response to this, Egypt joins the Squares. They do not want this. They are having none of this. And we quickly see that Egypt takes care of the Libyan problem, as it is called, and wipes out Libya in a matter of weeks. Egypt has grown to be a very strong country in this timeline, and Libya goes ahead and surrenders. Meanwhile, Egyptian troops arrive back on the front line, as the Mongols are reinvaded up into modern-day Syria and stuff. As we see that the Mongols send even more troops, and they fiercely fight to keep the Mesopotamian capital. While over here in modern-day Iraq, forces do go ahead and end up crossing into Persia, and they actually manage to go ahead and surround the Persian capital. And a huge victory takes place when they manage to secure the capital from the Mongols. Now I'm just kind of fixing the occupation zones; they're not fighting each other. And we see another huge loss for the Mongols happens when they manage to connect up, taking over all of the Arabian Gulf. Over in Europe, the Western European forces managed to outbeat the Mongol horde. They definitely have the economic advantages. And while the Mongols do have a lot of land, most of their manpower is over here in Asia, their main power base. This land is relatively not too fond of the Mongols and aren't really willing to fight for them. I mean, they're kind of forced to, but they aren't as patriotic. They're not gonna be like, oh no, the Mongols invading us. Although where is patriotic is Russia, as Russia was invaded by Poland, so they will. So the Russians up here will happily sign up to the Mongol army and will go ahead and beat back the Western Europeans, even going as so far to re-liberate their old land up here and take it back, although it's mainly lived. Although this is technically Estonia, but I guess it was technically owned by Russia, so whatever. However, over in the Ukrainian region, the coalition of the Ready will continue to do very well, even managing to re-liberate Crimea and pushing very far into territories, although when they get to the Russian areas, they will be heavily pushed back. Meanwhile, down over here, India will continue to do Indian things and do very well. However, Vietnam actually manages to push back India. The Vietnamese military has grown to be one of the strongest in the world with heavy funding from the Mongols. And also, Vietnam is just a pretty strong country in this timeline. But unfortunately for all the Indonesian supporters, it is the end for Indonesia, as they have been absolutely destroyed by both Vietnam and Australia, which has gone ahead and taken land here. And we even see Vietnam and Australia make another deal, and that deal is to divide up the Philippines as Vietnamese forces invade the Philippines. Now, you might be correct to point out that the Philippines weren't in the Pentagon Alliance. That is right. That's why they didn't really have much naval protection. And that was their mistake, as Australia and Vietnam have divided Southeast Asia. As the Australian Navy, which is one of the strongest in the world, will now focus its attention on helping out the Mongols and Vietnam, hoping to expand their influence up into Eastern Europe up here, although they wouldn't really take any land because that wouldn't make any sense. I guess we see Australia go ahead and take over these islands here, which some of them might be owned by Japan or something, so that's kind of cool. However, things aren't going too well for the Mongols over here, as we see the people in Persia begin rising up, and the Mongols are actually cut off from reaching their land over here, which is a huge blow. And they now have to send supplies up and around the Caucasus, which is terrible. However, they do make a huge counteroffensive, managing to re-establish a very small connection up here, which is very vital. However, over here, we see the Allied forces are pushing very heavily in Anatolia, where the people do not like being under Mongol rule and rise up. Well, over in Eastern Europe, we see the coalition of the Ready continues to make some advances, with them even pushing back up into these loyal Russians and doing a very good job at crushing them. And eventually, despite all these super loyal Russians, patriotic Russians, can do, they are no match for the complete might of all of Europe combined, in which will go very well And eventually, they managed to go ahead and capture the Russian capital, which is a huge blow to this front, as we see that the coalition of the Ready makes a promise to Russia that they will be restored with their old borders. And it's at this point the coalition of the Ready goes to the Russian people and is like, hey, we'll restore you with basically your complete old borders, although you will go ahead and lose this land up here, as long as you go ahead and join the fight and rise up. And they will go ahead and accept this, as we see that the Russian people fiercely rise up all across the country, leading to a huge loss in the Mongol front line over in Europe. Meanwhile, down in Southeast Asia, with nobody else to worry about, Vietnam can focus its full strength on India, who is fighting two fronts, as we see that Vietnam will go ahead and actually launch an invasion into India, doing incredibly well, managing to take major city after major city after major city. And it's at this point a lot of people are wondering, how is Vietnam so strong? And that is because Australia is sending a lot of their military into Vietnam. Australia is heavily committed to this war. And Australia has gone ahead and also called upon its other allies over in South America. Now, these are the fascist countries of the world. They lost India as their big protector, so they're now over to Australia. And I think that is it. These are the only three fascist countries in the world. So we do see these countries joined, and now you might be correct to point out they can't really do anything over here, but they will be sending funding and forces over to the Indian front. And basically, we have Australia, Vietnam, and these two countries focusing their full force on India, which is why they're losing. India is forced to retreat from up over in Persia, and they lose a lot of land, and they even give over a lot of their occupation over to the Arabian front, and are basically almost fully kicked out, and are even squished over here. So eventually these forces come under occupation of the Arabian country. But this does allow a huge pushback as they push back Vietnam pretty far, leaving them only in this area up here. And now what's interesting is that this area that has no major cities is the most fertile part of all of India. So weird that there's no cities there, but whatever. But we see that India is facing invasions from all sides, as despite being the second strongest country in the world, they are no match for the sheer amount of forces going into here. A lot of Asian forces are redirected over to the Chinese front. Obviously, some of them, but obviously a huge portion of them are going over to Europe and the Middle East, but a lot of them are going over to India. As it's kind of a stalemate over here, neither side can really win. Meanwhile, this war takes a huge shift where we see that the Arabian countries re-liberate Mesopotamia, and this literally screams patriotism all across the Middle East as former old empire countries begin rising up all over, and we quickly see that huge riots take place. Now I'm talking like millions of people are probably dying here in armed riots, but despite this deadly cost, it works as the Middle Eastern front completely collapses for the Mongol Empire, and we see over here that Greece manages to re-liberate its land and also finish off the remaining Mongol forces over here. Meanwhile, we see a huge push happen when we see that the Arabian forces meet up with the European forces. And we see a huge brand new united front line occur up here where the Europeans continue to push into this land. Meanwhile, the Arabian countries also do. It's at this point that the Europeans are kind of struggling to fight this war because they're sending troops so far away. Like, they're out of Europe now. The European front is a complete victory for the coalition of the Ready. However, what's not good for the coalition of the Ready is we see that in India, the front line is collapsing as these fronts manage to meet up. And combined forces in India are doing incredibly well, defeating India. And we even see that people end up rising up against the Indian government all across, as India is still an elite-ruled country. And we quickly see that these rebels form an opposition government down in the south. Now, don't get me wrong, these Indian rebels aren't like not fighting Vietnam. They aren't on Vietnam's side at all. But there is fighting over here. However, these rebels are enough for Vietnam to go ahead and make further gains. They are only stopped when they reach the core part of India, in which the fiercest resistance is faced. But we can see that most of India has fallen. And the East and South Asian front line is a huge win for the Circle Alliance. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East and Europe, they are losing. And it's at this point where we go ahead and see that the coalition of the Ready will go ahead and call on more people, particularly in Africa. We see a lot of these full democracy countries will go ahead and join this war as they know that it is the right thing to do. And we quickly see that all of these countries will begin committing troops, which is a huge win for the world. And we also see that the Unitarians and Alaska, as well as California, will also go ahead and enter this coalition. And I guess also Patagonia will enter this coalition. However, this is a pretty big mistake for Patagonia, as they're no match for their fascist northern neighbours and will quickly be overrun, although they were a distraction. And they were a pretty good distraction, as the Indian government makes a huge counter-offensive with these new forces. However, this Indian government is not the same Indian government as the rebels, or I guess like the opposition, the coup, I don't know what you call it, like the revolution has won. But these revolution forces will be getting the same aid as normal India was, and they will quickly go ahead and make a huge counter-offensive, managing to restore a pretty good portion of the country. Meanwhile, European troops flood into Central Asia. Now, Mongols really are protecting this land that much, which will go ahead and lead to a huge influx of troops doing very well over here. Meanwhile, the Siberian country will get basically fully liberated, and basically the whole country will just go ahead and return to Siberian control. And we see the Arabian front make huge offensives into Persia, as all of the African countries are sending all their troops here, as tens of millions and millions of troops are over here. And actually, we see that the green team is going to go ahead and be like, yeah, I'm here, look at me, I'm doing so well. As the green team was never taken over by the Mongols because they're on an island, and I forgot to colour them in. But nonetheless, we go ahead and see that these three front lines eventually meet around the Aral Sea, as the green team has done its duty to the world and has redeemed itself on the world stage. Meanwhile, the Arabian front continues to push over into Persia, although the terrain over here is very hard. But eventually they do manage to re-meet up with the Indian front line, which leaves almost all of India to eventually be liberated over on the Mongol front. Meanwhile, Vietnam continues to lose forces here, as most of the people in Vietnam are done with this war. You know, there's no point fighting. Like, we formed, like, Vietnam is huge now. Why are we fighting a country that has, like, 3 times our population with 3 times our manpower? And basically, India is just throwing its people at the Vietnamese military. And they're struggling to kill them all, basically. And it's at this point that we see the coalition on the ready is going to have to make a sacrifice, as this war is nowhere near ending. And they need to secure themselves an ally. And we see that they go over to Vietnam, and they promise them all of their land in Southeast Asia if they switch sides, which is huge, as they do go ahead and switch sides. Although India is kind of mad because it's like, well, they're not going to lose anything for this war. So Vietnam switches sides. Unfortunately for these countries down here, they're subject to Vietnam's rule. But we also see that Australia makes a deal to the coalition at the ready. It says, hey, I'll stop putting all my forces if you let me also have my land in Southeast Asia. And then we'll go ahead and accept this, as this is a problem they'll have to deal with later. And with this, these 2 fascist countries down here are also given this deal. They'll be able to get some land from Patagonia if they go ahead and leave, so they will. And now it's just the Mongols on their own. We're going to see all of India re-fall over, as Vietnamese troops now turn in to their once ally. And yeah, the Mongols were not expecting this. Millions and millions of troops from all these countries land in Vietnam, and Vietnam becomes a huge landing ground. And we quickly see that the Mongols are absolutely cooked, as tens of millions of Vietnamese, Indian, Japanese, Indonesian, I don't know what other ethnicities, but basically these troops storm into southern China and take over a huge portion of land. Over in Central Asia, we see that the red team has basically taken all of their land besides the Himalayas. Similarly over here, the Europeans have pushed basically as far as they can go, but they can't really push any further. And we go ahead and see a huge naval landing is made in Korea, which liberates the peninsula. As Korean forces move up into this land, where we see huge rebellions take place, the Siberian country regains all its land and the Seafan Green country rebels. And they will quickly launch an invasion with their troops and manage to easily retake their capital region like so. Over here, these countries will go ahead and rebel up and go ahead and join the European side, I guess, whatever. Over in Tibet, Tibetan rebels will retake control of this land, and we quickly see that basically every single Tibetan city will just go ahead and switch allegiance away from the Mongols. And yeah, the Mongols are not doing too hot. And I think something I forgot to go ahead and like preface is, where is the Mongol capital located? And the capital of the Mongol country is right here. Now I have made it a bigger circle, although I probably will just do this manually. But yeah, there we go. That's the capital of the Mongol country, for anyone wondering. We see the Seafam Green country make many spearheads encircling all its land and taking it out as they eventually move towards the Mongol capital. However, the Mongols are not done yet, as they launch huge counteroffensives, slamming into the seafoam green country, even managing to retake a lot of this land in a huge offensive. And they even push back the Europeans over here as the Mongols are holding out with all their life. However, in China, the people of China are done, and they begin swearing allegiance over to Vietnamese and invading forces. And we see that basically all of China is liberated. And at this point, the Mongol Empire is on their last legs. From the west, European forces pour in. From the north, the seafoam green country ravages the land. From the east, we see allied Japanese and Korean forces enter in. And from the south, Vietnamese forces ravage the land, until eventually we see that all four major groups meet up around the capital like so. And it is on this day that the Mongol capital will go ahead and fall, as millions of troops pour into the Mongol capital, and they find the leader of the Mongol country, and they execute him right there and there, no trial for you. And we go ahead and look at a peace treaty. And looking at this peace treaty, we can see that the whole world has been restored. No, joking. I'll go ahead and draw some of these borders. And there we go. This is the brand new peace treaty. We can see for the most part, old borders have been restored. This is the old map. This is the map at the start of the episode. This is the map now. I guess kind of main differences is Greece basically just annexed Crete. Russia lost Estonia. Egypt took land from Libya, and Libya has been given a new government. The Green Caspian country is now actually back. They're probably going to get blasted if I continue this. But probably the biggest change is over in Southeast Asia, as Vietnam is back on the world stage. And Vietnam is now the third strongest country in the world. And we see, looking at these military alliances, that basically every single military alliance is disintegrated. As the coalition of the ready has won this war, they've dismantled the Mongol Empire, and basically all land has been restored except Russia, Libya, Greece, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia. There have been land changes, but everywhere else has been restored. But the coalition of the ready has a brand new world order to go ahead and challenge. But unfortunately for the world, there is a brand new rising power, which is going to go ahead and form their own little alliance over here. Now, if you don't know what power I'm talking about, it's Vietnam. If I can go ahead and pull up the right colours. Vietnam will go ahead and create the Triangle Alliance, and they will actually invite Australia. And now the world has a brand new alliance to compete with. And now, I did say this was Vietnam's alliance. It's actually more like Australia's alliance. But they will go ahead and add these two fascist countries. Now, you might be like, Vietnam's a democracy, what the hell happened? And what happened is that leader was overthrown and they put in a fascist dictatorship instead. So yeah, fascism is back. That's cool, whatever. You might be like, why is this a threat? These countries don't seem too strong. I mean, they aren't in real life. And the reason for that is because the number one country is actually Australia. They were number 2 before the war, but India took a big hit. However, India is second. But the number 3 country is actually Vietnam over here. They have become very powerful. So we can see that the number 1 and the number 3 country have formed their own little alliance over here, which is a pretty big threat to democracy, as they may want to go ahead and install some fascist dictatorships elsewhere. The 4th strongest country is Ireland. They have a very strong economy. Number 5 are the Dutch. Number 6 is Norway. Number 7 is West Africa over here. I don't really know what to do for the rest of the rankings. I don't want to just give it over to Western Europe, but like Brazil, USA, and China, would any of them be rebuilt? Would the Unitarians be up here? You know what? Sod it. Unitarian plot armor, they're number 8. Let's just say they sold a bunch of weapons, like so, over to the Western Europeans. Number 9 will be Poland. And finishing off the top 10 will be Red Mesopotamia, which they were just in a war, but, you know, they deserve to be top 10 anyway, so they'll get top 10. And these are the top 10 power rankings. Now, we must wonder, how is the world going to react to this new fascist threat? Although I'm not reacting to that, I'm not doing that. If you guys actually want me to continue this scenario, I will go ahead and save this PDN, and maybe we can see this new fascist world order rising, and maybe we can see the return of fascism for the second time. But other than that, that is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this. This video is an hour long, at least the recording is. Don't know what it's going to be like to edit, don't know how long it's going to be. Hopefully it won't be too long. And also, if you couldn't tell, I'm sick. It's probably really obvious, and I'm probably going to hate editing this because I'll hear my sick voice. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.